Is reading the Old Testament basically reading somebody else's mail? Join me with Old Testament scholar John Walton. He has famously said, this is basically other people's text for their situation, namely Israel, and doesn't directly apply to us as Christians without a lot of work. So we'll explore that, and this is a second interview we've done with a biblical scholar, the first one with Josh Berman, where we put a series of texts to them, and we see how they work through those texts in various layers of interpretation. It got cut short because of internet problems that we could not resolve, but we're going to do a part 2 where we talk about his new book where he's updated ideas, his old ideas. He's changed his mind or nuanced his thoughts a bit on it. So we'll do that in a part 2 episode. This one, we're just going to go through these passages. Stay tuned.
This is the Biblical Mind Podcast, produced by the Center for Hebraic Thought. Honest 5-star reviews help others find this podcast. Visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org for articles and videos that explore the deep structures of Scripture.
Okay, so you have famously said in several books something I assume that you teach in your undergraduate classes and graduate classes as well, this idea of streams, like cultures as streams. And that
cultural rivers, yeah.
Yes, cultural rivers, sorry, yeah. And the rivers don't cross at any point that's easy for us to just stand in the cross streams and figure out. So what do you mean by this analogy, just for people who don't know, because we have a lot of lay listeners here, of these cultural rivers, and why is that important for your work?
So I talk about a cultural river as just a metaphor to understand all of the different aspects of any given culture that we live in. So our modern United States culture is characterized by certain ways of thinking, whether it's religion or politics or economics or values or priorities or whatever it might be. And those are all part of our cultural river. So, capitalism, democracy, that's all part of our cultural river. And it gives the shape to the culture. And any given person or group within that culture may like some of those things or may dislike them deeply. But there we are. We're in the middle of that cultural river. And most of our conversations and our interactions take place with that cultural river as the default backdrop, whether we are opposing it or agreeing with it. Sometimes we don't even realize there are other ways to think in our cultural river. So then when we talk about any other culture, either contemporary or talk about cultures of the past, it's beneficial for us to try to understand their cultural river. So when we look at ancient Israel or the ancient Near East in general, we can observe that nothing in our cultural river would make any sense to them at all. They wouldn't understand the words, they wouldn't understand the concepts. And so in that sense, we can't assume that they're just kind of talking about our cultural river.
Right.
But likewise, we need to understand their cultural river if we're going to understand their literature, because all literature is relevant within the cultural river. So cultural river is a good metaphor for trying to understand how cultures differ from one another, whether in a contemporary setting or kind of looking through time.
Yeah, so when you look at something like Genesis, which you've written quite a bit about, at least for lay folks, you've helped them understand various views on Genesis. Which cultural river do you think it swims mostly in? Is it floating in an Egyptian, an Egypto-Syrian cultural river, a Neo-Babylonian? Which one is the one you think is more prominent?
Well, as I look at the larger aspects of cultural river, which, we can look either on very minor issues or we can look at the big picture. I usually deal with more the big picture. And in that regard, there aren't huge differences in many areas between Egyptians or Babylonians or Israelites or Hittites or second millennium or first millennium. Certainly, Hammurabi's Babylon is different from Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon in important ways, but they still share the same larger framework. And so in that sense, sure, Egyptians think differently about certain things than Babylonians do, but they're still working on the same basic paradigm of what the world is and how it works. They might have different views of afterlife, and those are where we can zoom in on smaller issues, and we would want to chart out those differences. because of course they in a contemporary world of the ancient Near East, every culture is going to have its differences, but still there are lots of ways that they think the same. So when I talk about the cultural river in the ancient Near East, I'm generally content to talk about that general cultural river and then make distinctions as we look at more specifics. And that's pertinent for Israel, especially because they were supposed to be different in numerous important ways, but they still thought about the world in lots of the same ways. For instance, they think in terms of corporate community identity rather than individualism. Those are kind of the big things I'm talking
Right.
about. Um,
And things like, I mean, I'm of the persuasion, I'm not sure where you stand on these things, but I just put out a book on this, so you can critique it. The idea that, Israel followed the way law functions in the ancient Near East more generally, especially in Mesopotamia. They essentially followed the functioning of common law rather than later Roman statutory law. But they also have distinguishing features in their law that look nothing like Mesopotamian law, right? Or they're
that's a
doing
good
something very
example.
different. Yeah.
Yeah. My book on Lost Word of the Torah does similar things.
Yeah.
Their concept of what law is very similar. The specifics of law may show the differences.
Yeah. No, that's a good way to put it. And later, I want to come back to Genesis, some of the updates you've had in your thinking, because I think it's really telling when scholars kind of update or nuance their thinking, their previous written works. But let's just begin with Genesis 1 through 11. And Genesis, I think is, even for when I have undergrads read Genesis and I say, hey, break up the book however you outline it and break it up however you want. It's not unusual for students to break it up into 3 parts, or 2 parts at least, Genesis 1 through 11 and the rest, or Genesis 1 through 11, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then Joseph as the 3rd part. So I'm interested in how you think Genesis 1 through 11 functions within Genesis. Like, how do you see continuity there? Do you see it as a clean break, new start? How do you see that?
I see some very important continuity, but certainly they are of a different quality, but one leads into the other. On this, I follow a lot of the research that my son did in his doctoral dissertation, as he talked about the idea that in Genesis 1 through 11, we have God establishing order. That's the 7-day creation account. But then in 2 through 11, we have all of the various ways that people seek order, seek to establish it, seek to find it, seek to understand it, and in all the various ways that are very well known in the ancient Near East. And so they're looking for scenarios that are order bringing, such as being like God or dwelling in the divine realm. They're looking for strategies like agriculture or community. They are understand that they are image bearers and therefore order bringers. But chapter 3 tells us how they sort of go out on their own to bring their own order for their own agendas and purposes. So I see 1 through 11 hanging together very well in that pursuit of order, just like Ecclesiastes talks about the pursuit of how to resolve Hevel. Genesis 1 through 11 talks about the pursuit of order. And that very, very helpfully then dumps into chapter 12, where we find out God's understanding of what establishes order in the human realm, and that's the covenant, and eventually with the Torah. But the covenant itself as a relationship between God and people, as offering divine presence eventually with the building of the temple. Those are the order-bringing aspects that sort of have God's stamp of approval on them. And so in that way, 1 through 11, even though it's a different literary quality than 12 through 50, its topics move very easily from one section into the other.
That bringing order, it sounds superficially very Egyptian conceptually. The idea that order is paramount for humans?
Well, certainly that's represented in Ma'at, but you also can find it in the Mesopotamian literature very easily. Lots of Assyriologists now are talking about that sort of thing when they look at big synthesis kinds of pictures. And it carries out in some of the terminology in Akkadian literature as well. We even have the Sumerian piece, Enkian World Order, that show these elements. And again, in my son's dissertation, he tracked the terminology all through Egyptian and Hebrew and Akkadian and Sumerian to show that this is sort of on everybody's minds. And that's one of those issues in the cultural river, the idea that order is sort of the highest value and therefore of the greatest interest, whether they're dealing with the cosmos or dealing with society.
Yeah, and given the especially for Israel, the agrarian subsistence situation, order plays a very special role, as it does in the ancient Near East more broadly, but they don't have wide rivers to feed them water, to water their crops with, right? Okay, so you see this theme of order that can take different linguistic and literary shapes in various cultures and civilizations in the ancient Near East. Do you see anything specifically in the language that's used in Genesis 1 through 11 and how that gets used in the rest of the Torah? Or, I mean, Genesis 1 through 11 is unique for so many different reasons, but linguistically or literarily, do you see connections there?
Well, some of the basic terms that we encounter in Genesis 1 through 11 continue to be important terms as you work through the rest of the Torah, through the rest of the Hebrew Bible. These are terms that, as English readers, we don't necessarily identify with order. But once you see order as sort of the prime value, you can start to see it. So whether it's the absence of it with tohu vavohu in Genesis 1-2, or it's the presence of order, tov, it was good, which has to do with order, not morality or design, and even things that are not good. It's not good for humans to be alone. That's an order issue. But also words like shalom and rest, menucha, these are terms in the order spectrum. Even terms like ra, which is often translated evil, as you know, is less connected with morality and more connected with order, because God can do ra.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so we have terminology like that helps us to see these issues being carried through. But again, if we've not understood them as terms in the order spectrum, we can miss the connections.
Yeah, I often will translate Ra in certain contexts as unraveling, where God just lets the consequences flow.
It's disruptive.
Yeah.
It disrupts order.
Yeah.
As someone's trying to do it.
But even something like Ra, which has a very rich, I mean, it's used in many different ways and has a wide spectrum. And unfortunately, for reasons I would probably trace to medieval Europe, we flatten it out and something is either good or evil, and twixt and twain, it cannot be in between.
Right.
Which is not helpful at all in understanding the text, which then means you have to kind of hide evil in the translations and say, I'll commit disaster or something like that.
And that's because our Western way of thinking, maybe it goes back to medieval, I don't know, but tends to view things through lenses that are connected to a moral spectrum. We always want to sort out good and evil. And in my work, and my son John's as well, we talk about the order spectrum as the basic framework, which is tripartite because it's non-order, which is just the absence of order, tohu vavohu, and then order, which is an accomplished state, and then disorder, which is disruptive of order that already exists. So, and that tripartite spectrum helps considerably in dealing with interpretation of the Bible and ancient Near Eastern documents.
Yeah. Do you fear the critique that would obviously go with something like this is when you're carrying a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So if you got the order hammer, you just start seeing it everywhere. How do you differentiate that?
Well, again, you just have to be careful to try to make sure you're not just reading it in. So we want to see how those terms are being used. The the same flaw is possible with any lenses you use. If you use the moral spectrum, you see everything in moral senses. So there are dominant ways of thinking, and terminology often reflects them. But we try to locate that in the ways that the terms are used contextually. So even things like chatat, to say sin, that puts it in the moral spectrum. But we know that the chatat offering is for impurity as well, which is not a moral issue.
Right.
It's an order issue. And so it falls into place pretty easily. It doesn't have a forced feeling to it. Though I'm sure it can be overstated as well.
Well, and we're all guilty of thesisizing our ideas in places.
Yeah.
But and I think what I'm always interested in is where there's a lexical and a conceptual overlap, where the language and the concept meet. And then with Hebrew, you always have to make room for the places where there's the language but not the concept, or vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
So that's Genesis 1 through 11, and that gives you. So let's walk that out a little bit. So in the patriarchs, what does order look like, just roughly?
Well, again, the covenant is now the framework. Okay. So that's God bringing order through initiating a covenant, which is a relationship. And it's a relationship with prospects connected to it. Those prospects, some of them are worked out in Genesis 12 through 50. Others are not so much. Again, presence eventually becomes part of it, but that's not till the building of the tabernacle, constructing of the tabernacle. So, but we can see that the covenant is put in place. And then as we go through all of the narratives in Genesis 12 through 50, we see that covenant and its prospects as the elements that drive the narratives. Every narrative has to do with covenant. It has to do with either land or family or blessing. It has to do with either those things being established and set up against obstacles, or we see obstacles put in place. Whether it's the character of Jacob and Esau, or whether it's the favoritism, or whether it's the barrenness, these are obstacles to the covenant, and they're things that work contrary to order. Yet the covenant marches forward, and order is brought as those obstacles are overcome and the problems resolved.
So it's interesting because I think someone could very easily hear the order thesis and think, oh, deistic, cold, calculating, something more like that. But it sounds very relational the way that you're working it.
It is. Yeah. And that also differentiates it from how order is sometimes discussed in our modern times.
Right.
Voices like Jordan Peterson, who see order as very destructive and imperialistic and controlling and those sorts of things. That's not how they're viewing it. It's a desirable state in the ancient world. And we carry it over that way too when we talk about law and order. Yes, right. we want those things. So we're not thinking of it in imperialistic terms or those kinds of scenarios.
Now, you made a move there that I want to highlight. Is you went from biblical sense of relational order, and then you went straight to Jordan Peterson, which I love because he needs as much celebration as critique. So do you think there is like a theologically appropriate use of what you see in order in the Torah, and turning to today and saying, okay, so these should be some guiding principles, or maybe some fences that we put around the field that keep us restrained with thinking about order and life and law and liberty and those things?
Mm-hmm. Now, most of the Torah, as we talked about in my Lost World of Torah, I see as descriptive. That is, it's showing how order was set up for Israel in their time. It is contingent on the presence of Yahweh, because lots of the things have to do with maintaining that presence. It has to do with the ancient world and things that were considered order bringing in the ancient world. And so in that sense, it's also contingent on the covenant relationship between Israel and God, which was something unique to them. Nothing else like it that we know in the ancient world. And of course, that doesn't carry over to us. We're not part of that covenant. So to that extent, we can view the Torah descriptively as showing what order would look like in an Israelite covenant, ancient Near East context. How much that has to do with what order looks like today is another topic entirely and needs to be taken very carefully. We do not tend to just extract principles and then carry them over as if this principle now carries authority for us because we got it from the Bible.
Right.
Principles you can make up on your own just as easily.
So when you see Jesus making these moves, which I would take to be not ham-fisted moves, but where he takes the Torah, he reaffirms the Torah because he's part of Israel and he believes it's meant for him as well. But then he, with the divorce, he doesn't go back to Moses' legislation on divorce. He goes back to creation and says, hey, it wasn't so from the beginning. And so like you're thinking in terms of Moses and what I can do and what I can't, but actually you're not thinking of this bigger motif. Do you see that as him moving? I mean, it's in some ways it's an intra-Jewish debate, but he seems to be recontextualizing the Torah even for his own people who have the same covenant. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I agree. That's what he's doing. Redeploying, recontextualizing, bringing application. And of course, when he identifies a principle, I'm good with it.
Okay.
Just there's a question about how much we can do that.
Right.
Yeah, but also when he extends, he says, you've heard it said, don't murder, but there's a lot more going on here that you need to be aware of.
Right. Yeah, and in some ways he's just digging back into the Torah more deeply and saying, you're not putting all the pieces together here. And then the question for Christians is how prescriptive is what Jesus is doing there, right? Or what Paul is doing where they're digging back into the Torah and finding these principles and pushing them forward.
Well, certainly I would consider Jesus and Paul to be prescriptive in what they're affirming. Again, Jesus isn't saying the Torah is for everybody, but he's drawing teaching from it that we consider very important and authoritative and prescriptive. Still, some of it is within their cultural context, and we have to parse that out as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I always say the worst theology I've ever heard is when people say, well, the scriptures say X, so therefore I believe Y. And I'm like, well, it's never that simple, right?
Right.
Okay, so maybe, and again, you can feel free to punt. Josh Berman did on one or two of these. But what do you make of the paralleling, and not only just the paralleling, some of the reuse of the exact same language in Judges 19 and Gibeah from Sodom and Gomorrah? What do you think the authors there are trying to accomplish? And of course, it depends on which one you think is written first, Genesis or Judges.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
And of course, I don't try to sort out what got written when.
Right.
The book that I did with The Lost World of Scripture, we talked about the importance of oral traditions and how these things were passed on orally and when they finally got written down. To me, late compilation, I should say, late compilation doesn't suggest late ideas. It's maybe a later processing of ideas that have been there for centuries. So I'm very, very comfortable with that idea, but that means I can't really say which one was written first. There's clearly some intertextuality going on. Again, whichever one is relating to the other, there's clearly intertextuality. But if we don't know the order in which they were written, then all we can say is these are ways that they're trying to draw these two things together paradigmatically, conceptually, and we can see those similarities and see those differences without really having to judge on which one came first.
Yeah, it does seem if you don't have the priority of the text, the similarities and differences then make there's less you can do with the differences, I guess, because you're not quite sure why the difference is there or what they're doing with it rhetorically.
But again, intertextuality is a very complex process, and we all engage in some level of intertextuality all the time. Sometimes we don't even know it. And so we shouldn't be surprised that the literary producers in ancient Israel should seek patterns and connections. That's what literature does.
Yeah.
So it's not surprising. That doesn't suggest that either the accounts is artificial. It just says they saw some similarities between the scenarios and the situations, and they draw that out as they tell their stories.
There is a phrase used today that actually I use now to explain intertextuality, which is just the allusion or echoing or borrowing or quotation of some other text and connecting them together. Have you heard this? If you know, you know. Have you seen this?
No, I don't think so.
Oh, okay. Well,
You know?
it's basically
No?
you say something suggestive, and people who know that other thing that you're talking about, you don't have to say anything more. Like if we say,
Right, right.
yeah,
Absolutely.
SBL late night dinners or whatever. If you know, you know. Like if you've been there, you know exactly what we're talking about. Yeah. So there's all kinds of hooks, linguistic hooks and conceptual hooks where you can grab other text and pull them in. But again, if you don't, because very strong beliefs about which one was written first, it becomes problematic to say which one is pulling the other one in and for what reason. Yeah.
Yeah.
But if there is a more ancient tradition, an oral tradition, then they're clearly pulling on something that people would have been known in their time. That's the idea,
Right.
right?
The literature doesn't have to be in its final form for those intertextual, you know, oral intertextual connections to be made.
Right.
So,
Okay, so one that I'm interested then is what do you do with the paralleling, a similar issue of Joseph and Daniel, where I don't think you would know better than I don't think the linguistic connections are as tight between Joseph and Daniel, but the
mhm.
conceptual connection is unmissable.
Oh,
So
yes.
yeah, so
Uh,
what do you do with that passage in
Well,
Daniel?
of course, I've done a commentary on Genesis and now have finished up a commentary on Daniel, so I've worked with it from both ends. We did more with it in the Daniel commentary than I did in the Genesis commentary, because here I think we more clearly have a situation where Daniel comes after the Joseph story whenever Genesis came into its final form. So the idea that the compilers of Daniel have shaped this account to bring to mind some of the aspects of the Joseph story. Again, that's just good storytelling. It relates to things that people know and says, look, these are similar sorts of things. There are a few linguistic connections, if I recall. I don't have the details right at my fingertips, but you're right. It's mostly conceptual. And not just conceptual, but circumstantial, the
Mhm.
circumstances that they were in and that idea of how they are interacting with the courtiers, interacting with dreams of the ruler, those kinds of ideas. So there's plenty of conceptual things. And of course, there have been books written on this. So
Hmm.
no
I see.
surprises there.
Okay. Real quick, I'm interested and again, you can pass if you want. What do you make of Exodus 1 through 4, which is, we have to do the traditional, it's set in a patriarchal world where men are in charge supposedly. And then you have this book that opens up with the rescue of Israel begins with all of these women who act heroically. And as we know, there are almost no men involved until you get past the rescue of Moses. So what do you think is going on with all these women front-loaded in the Exodus story?
I'm not sure that I'm comfortable making a lot out of that distinction because it feels to me like we're imposing our own cultural interests on that. We're interested in, are men primary place or are women primary in place? And if we see this, then that means that. But that's sort of our own cultural river as we are attuned to those emphases. And I'm not sure that we can just push that into the ancient world literature to say that they were similarly aware. It's clear that there was respect for some of the things that women did, but maybe they wouldn't have doubted that in the ancient world. It's only
Right.
because we seem to have this thing going on of misogyny that becomes more significant in our minds. So uh, I one of the categories I've talked about recently is what I call situated readings. That is, when we read the Bible especially, from our own vantage point of our own identity. And there's good reasons to do that. There's good ways to do that. There's benefit in doing that. But when we adopt a situated reading, we may, without thinking, impose certain categories or perspectives on the text that they wouldn't have had. So I guess in the situation you raise in Exodus 1 through 4, I'm just alert, sensitive to whether we might be guilty of doing that.
Yeah, agreed. So let me reframe the question. In light of the rest of the book of Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, where women do not play that prominent of a role, except for Miriam and a few other instances, the daughters of Zelophehad, but you don't have this many women in a row. So it does seem just statistically anomalous when compared to the rest of the literature of the Torah.
Well, from a particular standpoint, you could say truth is stranger than fiction. This is just the reality. Certainly, when they're talking about some of the major things that happen, yes, men were the moving pieces, but that doesn't mean there aren't times when women couldn't be. And for the text just to present those ideas, I don't think they're trying to leave women out in the other parts of the text. It's just these are things that pertained to men and what men were doing, which is not a surprise in the ancient world.
Yeah. And even Genesis, when people call Genesis patriarchal in the kind of this social way, and even Carol Meyer has pointed this out, that, it's really the women who are calling the shots in almost the entire book of Genesis, and at least in the major movements of the book of Genesis. Mm-hmm. And that's not always a good thing either, right? So sometimes they're calling fouls and strikes. So it's not like when you enter the book of Exodus or leave it that women have no voice and women aren't doing anything, of significance, I should say. Yeah. And maybe that's just how the story went.
Well, economically and politically, it's certainly a man's world. Right. There were exceptions, of course, but that's how the world was. That doesn't necessarily mean the culture was patriarchal. Mm-hmm. Carol Myers has done a lot of work with this and tried to bring some nuance to our conversation. And it's just reflecting the world as it was. And there were standard roles for men and women, and those roles are part of what felt like it was ordered. I love Fiddler on the Roof, that introducing song Tradition, which explains how they understood order in their social world. Everyone with their roles and their places, not necessarily making one role more important than the other, but they're all important, and everybody does their bit for what, and that brought order. And of course, the whole musical is about how that order was dissolving, both social order and political order, hand in hand as they go through the musical. It's a great example of how we think about that. But they had a different concept of social order than we do in the United States today. And even the political order had aspects that we don't experience. But order is from the perspective of the culture.
So speaking of musicals, Exodus 14 and 15, this passage where you have the story of the crossing of the Red Sea, and then you have a song. I have never seen Fiddler on the Roof, and I often admit to when I was in New York, I had all these students who were musical theater students, and I would say I'm actually just not a big fan of musicals in general. There's some that I like, but like in general, I'm going to be averse to a music. And they would always try to figure out why, as if it were a moral problem. Like you said, they read it through a moral lens. Like something's wrong with Dr. Johnson if he doesn't like musicals. And I was like, no, it's just people have different tastes. And then I said, I just don't like it when people, like it's normal and then people break out into song. And one kid goes, you mean like in the Old Testament? And I was like, oh, okay. Touche, good point. So in Exodus 15, we get this almost retelling of an account that we just saw from a very different perspective. And I wonder, Do you see Exodus 15, the poetry that's embedded in the narrative, do you see it as necessary or illustrative or just kind of, a puffy example of the facts of the case, or something else entirely?
I guess I see it as reflecting maybe we could say holistic way that people thought about. I mean, it was song and poetry that often continued their oral traditions. That made it easy to remember. I mean, I'm still always amazed at myself when I'm sitting in a diner and I hear a song from the 60s and I know all the words.
Mm-hmm.
Music does that, even though I haven't heard that song for decades.
Mm-hmm.
Music does that. And so poetry does the same. They have built-in elements that connect to our memory. So community memory, collective memory is best embodied and preserved in poetic and musical terms. So I'm not surprised that as they craft the narratives in the final compilation, whenever that took place, whoever did it,
Right.
that they included these well-known ancient songs which had preserved the tradition all these generations.
And that, unfortunately, is where the interview ended. We had too many internet problems. We tried for another 10 or 15 minutes to make it work, and we couldn't get the connections resolved. So we agreed that when he came back from Europe and when I was back over in the UK, that we'd try again and we'd talk about his new book, where he has updated and nuanced some of the views that he's put out there on the Old Testament. He's looked at new scholarship and he's, I wouldn't say changed his mind, but he certainly came to slightly different conclusions or fuller conclusions. So it's always good to hear a seasoned scholar think about their own thinking in the rearview mirror. So that'll be part 2. We'll shoot that in a few weeks and put that out as part 2. So I hope you come back to hear more from John Walton.
You've been listening to the Biblical Mind podcast, exploring the deep structures of Christian scripture. For more, visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org. Subscribe to this podcast at all the usual places so you never miss an episode.